All right, so putting this all together, order of operations. So the composition of mathematics oh, defines order of operations. This is what we've learned, what we've seen, which guides problem structure and the steps to evaluating mathematical expressions. So I'm just going to put this together because order of operations, I know some of you are like, well, I know order of operations, that's PEMDAS, right? So parentheses, exponents, and there's other acronyms for it too, but multiplication and division left to right, addition and subtraction left to right. And that is actually not how mathematics is written. We want to take advantage of composition of math. And what it does for us when we evaluate, it actually defines order of operations. So there's going to be no more PEMDAS. Math is not that restrictive. So how do we evaluate or calculate the value of mathematical expression? And we've been doing it all along, but it frees us up in so many ways. So first of all, we want to read the composition. So the first step is to read composition. So identify the separate terms and then identify the separate factors in each term. So factors and operators. So we know how to identify these things. And then as we evaluate, it sort of makes sense. If factors make up terms and terms make up expressions, then the evaluation of it is basically from the most basic component on. So the first thing we do, once we have identified, the first thing we do is evaluate all the group factors, then factor operators, everything dealing with individual factors of those terms. After we find the factor values, we can multiply those to find the value of the terms. Once we have the value of all of our terms, then we can find the value of our expression by combining all its terms. And it's just like trying to read English. In order for me to understand a sentence or an expression, I need to be able to identify every term, every word in that sentence. And in order for me to understand the word, I have to be able to understand every letter that makes up that word. So in terms of math, and mathematical expression is made up of terms, terms are made up of factors. I need to know all the factor values of each term before I can find the value of that term. The order in which you do this does not matter. The value of the expression is then just the sum of all of its term values. And again, when you combine these term values, it doesn't matter what order. So it helps us with problem structure. We just want to keep track of the separate terms and factors. So let's look at a few more complicated expressions and see what we mean by this. So when we evaluate this first expression, again, we're using and reading composition first. So step one, read composition. All right, so I'm looking for my individual terms separated by plus or minus outside of grouping symbols. So this has four separate terms. Okay, I want to find the value of each of these terms in any order I want. It doesn't matter what order. But to find the value of the terms, I have to go in and know and how to identify the value of all the factors in the terms. So let's just start with this term. What are the factors of the third term? Well, it's a -5 and times the square root of 9, and the square root of 9 has a factor value of 3. So the two factors in this term are -5 and 3. So I can go ahead and find the term value, and I'll just keep track of it in this column. It's a -15. Okay, so I'm going to do that for all the terms. It doesn't matter which term you find first, which term value. So let's do the second one. Again, I have a negative sign outside of the parentheses. So the factors are -1 and then a -2 cubed. And again, I could write it out, but the value of -2 cubed is -8. Once I have my factor values, then I got the term value. -1 times -8 is +8. So I'm done with that term. Of course, the term value here is 8. That's another +8. I got to keep track of that. And then out here I see the absolute value. The negative sign is a factor of -1. And then I have to take the absolute value of -7 and 4. This is two terms. -7 and 4 is -3. So before I take the absolute value, I need to know the factor. It's a nested or a grouped factor. Now, do I take -1 times -3? No, because the absolute value of -3 changes the factor value to +3. So -1 is a factor value and +3 is the factor value. This term value then is -3. So I've gone through and I have all of my term values, and it's separated. It didn't matter what order I did those in. I just needed to make sure I kept track of those values. Once I have them, I can start combining. So maybe I can take the first two 8s here and combine those terms, +16. -15 and -3 is a -18. Notice I stop my columns because I'm just evaluating or combining terms. 16 and -18 is -2. Okay, everything should be vertical because terms are written in their columns. The factors that I work with in each term, and then just keeping track of those. So what's the difference between that one and the next one? And again, this is why it's so important. How composition allows us to see the separate terms and factors. So what's important? I have the same kind of expressions, if you notice, but in this one, the composition is different. So here's a negative sign outside of parentheses, so I have a term here. But all the other negative signs are inside grouping symbols. So this only has 2 terms. Now, to find the value of my terms, right, I got to start evaluating the factors and recognizing the factors. So again, I have a -1 factor. I'm going to keep track of that. The -2 cubed, right, I remember as a factor of -8. I just did that before, but it's a factor of this term. The next grouping symbol is grouping 2 factors. So again, I have a -5 and then a factor of 3. Now this is going to be a factor of -15. I'm keeping track. These are all factors. So I don't want to introduce any more lines. I don't want to do anything like that. So this would be the absolute value of -3. And the absolute value of -3, I want to keep track as a factor value of 3. So I have all my factor values. I kept track. In this second term, I found all the factor values. So now once I have those, then I can evaluate. This would be a +8 times -15, or -8 times -15 is a +120. -1 times that times 3 would be a term value then of -360. Now that's just one of my terms. I also have my 8 as another term value. So again, the column is telling me to keep track of those term values. Once I have my term values, now I can finally combine. -360 and 8 is a -352. Okay, the more complicated the expression gets, the more important it is to keep track of the composition. So in this one, in this expression, I know it's big, but I have 2 terms. So it's important for me to eventually get the value of each term. Now, what are the factors? So the factors in this first term is just the square root. It's this one factor. So eventually, I know that I want the factor value, the square root of something. What's that factor value? So let's work inside the square root. Okay? Inside the square root, I have two terms. So I have a 12, and I have a -3 times a -8. -2 cubed, we run into that a few times. This term is a positive 24. 12 and 24 is 36. Now, 36 is the value inside the square root. So again, it was important for me to realize this was one factor with the square root. The square root of 36, this term would be a positive 6. So doing this one, a factor of -1, and then I have, whoops, let me write that down a little bit more, and then I have the absolute value. So eventually I want to know the absolute value. Inside the absolute value I have two terms. So I'm going to evaluate inside the opposite of 7 squared, or this term would be a -1 times 7 squared is 49. This term inside that would be a -49. Here, the second term, I have a factor of 4, and -2 cubed, which was that -8. 4 and -8 is a term value of -32. So the value inside the expression, we want to keep track as that factor, but the value inside would be a -81. So now our factors are -1 and the absolute value of -81, which is positive 81. So this term value now is a -81. Okay, so now I have my two term values. I kept track of the columns. Positive 6 and -81 is a positive 75 for my expression value. So keep track, use composition. It allows you to evaluate terms in any order, evaluate factors within terms in any order, and keep track of those components as you go.